Finding the right gift for someone who has everything. My dad owned everything. At least that was my teenage perspective when it came to getting my dad a gift for Christmas. What in the world can I get Dad for $10 that he doesn't already have? I asked my mom in 1967. Your father needs dress shocks, the kind with the gold toe, said Mom. I could do that, thought I, at 16, and so I did. About a week after Christmas, I found those gold toe socks in my drawer. What's up with that, Mom? Your dad likes the long socks, that go up his calves, and, you got the short socks. Oh, said I at 16. That's great. I can use some dress socks. I think it was something like 10 years later, 1977, I was putting on those gold toe socks, now quite worn, when it finally hit me that I had given my father what is called a white elephant gift in 1967. Sorry, Dad. We celebrate the birthday of Jesus in 6 days. And, of course, we're going to give each other gifts, but what about Jesus? What do we give him? Well, fortunately, God has a Christmas list, and we find it in the Bible. And number one on that list is so essential that if we leave it off, anything else we do or give, no matter how big or sacrificial, is a white elephant gift in God's eyes. Am I exaggerating? See for yourself. Hebrews 11:4 says that by faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. I looked up the Greek word translated offering or sometimes a sacrifice, and I discovered that it comes from a root word that means gift. And I noticed that some gifts are better than others, which leads to the question, what makes one white elephant and another acceptable in God's eyes? Let's look at the rest of the verse. By faith, Abel was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings, that is, his gifts. Now, what is meant by God spoke well of Abel's gifts? I mean, when we speak well of a gift, we show it off. But when we receive a white elephant gift, we speak not. My dad did not speak well or ill of my gift to him in 1967. He didn't speak of it at all. So what did God speak well of, or so to speak, show off? Look at the rest of the verse. By faith, Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. Now, do you see it? 3 times in this one verse, 28 times in this one chapter, we find the word faith. And that is a loud clue as to what pleases God. Faith. But it's more than just, one of the things that's on his list. 2 verses later, in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6, we learn that without faith, it is impossible to please God. Because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. Now, anyone can believe in some sort of God that exists. I mean, even the demons, but the kind of belief and the kind of God described in this verse is a belief in the uncaused, uncreated, created God of the Old Testament. And it takes faith to believe God exists. And it should be noted that it takes faith to believe that such a God doesn't exist. And if someone says science proves such a God doesn't exist, ask for the proof. And if they say, I'll get back with you, don't hold your breath. Scientific proof that God doesn't exist, nor will it ever exist. The faith of Hebrews 11:6 is faith that God exists and that he's personally involved in his creation. He's not aloof. He rewards those who earnestly seek him, and by implication, he does not reward those who fail to earnestly seek him. Let's reflect on impossible to please God. If the uncaused, uncreated, necessary God of the Old Testament exists, then it is logically impossible for this God not to exist. He cannot not exist. And this is a deduction based on logic and the fundamental nature of the God of the Bible. But when it comes to pleasing God, we cannot deduce what pleases him by logic. It must be revealed, just as it was necessary for my dad to reveal what kind of socks pleased him and didn't please him. And the Bible reveals that God's nature is such that it is impossible for his image bearers to please him without faith. Therefore, number one on God's Christmas wish list, something that must not be left off, is the gift of persevering faith. Now, the readers of that day understood that the opposite of faith is unbelief. But in our day, the opposite of faith is considered to be reason, as if faith was irrational. But that's not what the Bible teaches. Hebrews 11:1 defines biblical faith as the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And this leads to the question, is this assurance and convictions of things not seen blind faith? Pie in the sky hope with no evidence. It is blind in that we can't see physically faith. But neither can we see physically gravity, sound, magnetism, Wi-Fi, thoughts, imagination, taste, electricity, and the unseen phenomena that Jesus refers to in his conversation with Nicodemus. Do you remember? The wind blows wherever it pleases. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it's going. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit. Jesus teaches that unseen faith is not blind. It is not without evidence. In fact, after several men lower a paralyzed friend through the roof for Jesus to heal, Mark 2:5 says, Jesus saw their faith. And after this miraculous healing, everyone was amazed and declared, we have never seen anything like this. Now, many in our day believe that science explains or will explain everything. But that belief is not a statement of science. It is ironically a statement of faith in science. Biblical faith is reasoned faith that follows the evidence of creation that points to a creator, of design that points to a designer, of the moral law that points to the moral law giver, and the greatest evidence of all that a 2-year-old could understand, I'll make it 3, the Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children, born of the Spirit. And reason informs us that an all-wise, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-holy God is wiser, more powerful, more knowing, more holy than we are. And what could be more reasonable than that? And that's why reason is never so reasonable as when it reasons to put faith in an all-wise God whose very essence is reason. Look at the 28 references to faith in Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, God's people were courageous in battle, patient in suffering, and joyful in difficulty. They acted in response to God's commands and promises, even when they could not see or understand the reason for what they were being asked to do. And this reasonable faith pleases God. He spoke well of their gift. So let's give the gift of persevering faith. Take out the insert in your bulletin. I believe there is an insert in your bulletin, which I am calling the Jesus Christmas list. It's a suggestion of gifts he wants for Christmas. Write down your gift with a promise and a prayer. Dear God, empowered by the Holy Spirit, I resolve to give the gift of faithfully praying every day, even if I do not always see immediate answers to those prayers. To give the gift of giving thanks in all circumstances, even when those circumstances seem confusing. To give the gift of faithfully reading and submitting to your word every day and acting upon it. To give the gift of regular giving of my income to the church and to the poor, even when my own finances are tight, and so on. New Year's resolutions are not found in the Bible, but godly resolutions are. Daniel resolved not to defile himself. King Jehoshaphat resolved to inquire of the Lord. David resolved not to sin with his mouth. The Apostle Paul resolved to know nothing except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And Jesus himself resolutely set his face to go to Jerusalem in obedience to his Bible, the Old Testament, that prophesied the Messiah's crucifixion. We become children of God by God's grace. But faith resolutions are not about becoming a child of God any more than giving my earthly dad a Christmas gift made me a child of Leonard Rasmussen. The next Christmas, the one after the gold toe socks fiasco, I spent 3 months building, constructing, and painting a model of the United States Constitution. And I gave it to my dad for Christmas. And my dad spoke well about this gift and forgot all about the gold toe socks that I was still wearing. Now you do understand, the money it took to purchase that boat came from my dad. Likewise, the faith we give to God is the very faith he gives to us. Nevertheless, when we offer what he gives to us as a gift, the one who really does own everything will speak well of it. But there's another aspect to faith that is on God's Christmas list. I will call this risk-taking faith. Persevering faith is the long-term, year after year, repeated actions. But risk-taking faith is a one-time faith action. Is there someone you need to reach out to with the love of Jesus that would require an outrageous act of faith on your part? Go for it. Take a risk. Step out in faith, as they say. Write that letter, send the card, make the phone call, offer to pray with them. But before you do, ask God. Otherwise, risk-taking may become obnoxious pushiness or just plain foolishness. Remember, before Peter jumped out of the boat, he asked Jesus for permission. But if we only pray, then our faith is like a body without a spirit, which, according to James, is dead faith. Bible teacher Bruce Wilkerson, in his introduction to the book of James, in his daily walk devotional, wrote, "For James, a faith that produces no change in a person's life is no faith at all. True faith will bear fruit in actions and deeds." James offers many tests for genuine faith. It endures trials, obeys the word, harbors no prejudice, controls the tongue, is separated from the world, and resists the devil. Above all, faith waits patiently for the coming of the Lord. What else beside faith is on God's list? Well, look what Peter says to slaves serving harsh masters. "For it is commendable if a man bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because he is conscious of God. If you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God." What is commendable? Slavery? Unjust, undeserved suffering? Of course not. Bearing pain and suffering for God's sake, His glory, especially if it's unjust. That's commendable. But we can only do this if we are more conscious of God than we are of pain and suffering. You see, pain and suffering causes us to be conscious of our suffering more and more. That's all we can think of. As a result of thinking of suffering, our suffering increases and our awareness of God decreases. But what is commendable, what brings God's glory, is when our suffering causes us to be conscious of God more and more, and therefore pain and suffering decreases as our awareness of God increases. It is good to ask God to remove the thorn of pain and suffering. There is nothing unspiritual about doing that. But in the meantime, ask God to empower you to be more conscious of Him than the pain, and in so doing, you will discover His grace is sufficient whether He removes the thorn in your lifetime or not. This is commendable in God's sight. One day God will remove slavery, but in the meantime, being conscious of God allowed them to be free of the suffering. In Billy Graham's book, Hope for the Troubled Heart, he illustrates this truth by telling Gretchen's story. Gretchen's world changed one morning in 1982 when a drunk driver forced her car into a fatal spin, hurling it across the freeway where it exploded in a burning inferno, instantly killing her mother, but not her, much to her regret. Before that dreadful day, Gretchen led a sun-filled life. She was beautiful, wealthy, had an attentive husband. In the nightmare of that horrible night, she lost everything. She lay in a coma for 6 weeks. When she came to, she discovered that her face was virtually gone, and she did not want anyone to see her, even after 70 operations. 70. Her face was cruelly disfigured. She had a blank socket where an eye should have been. Her reconstructed nose, scarred skin, and missing arm would always be evidence that she had been in a hideous accident. It was after one of her more than 70 operations that she attended a Billy Graham crusade and gave her life to Christ. That was the turning point. After 7 years of seclusion and wishing she could have died in that accident with her mother, she now realized that God had saved her in that accident for a reason. She began to volunteer at the rehab center where her own disabilities gave her the credibility to reach out to others. And when she was asked about her greatest joy, she answered, "It is waking up in the morning and knowing nothing is an accident." Richard Dawkins, who wrote the book The God Delusion, said, "We are machines built by DNA whose purpose is to make more copies of the same DNA. This is exactly what we are for," says Dawkins. "It is every living object's sole reason for living." Dawkins also said, "Nature is not good or evil, or cruel or kind, but simply callous, pitiless, and indifferent to all suffering, lacking all purpose." So, Dr. Dawkins, which is it? Nature is an accident with no purpose? Or DNA is our sole reason and purpose for living? Now, if the former, if everything is an accident without purpose, then wouldn't Dawkins' brain and the thoughts in his head and his teachings about accidents be nothing but an accident? If the latter, I must ask, pray tell, how does DNA know what its purpose is? Who told the DNA what to do? And where did DNA get the authority to dictate our sole reason for living? Dawkins doesn't resolve his contradictions. Now, contrast Dawkins with C.S. Lewis, who said, "There is no neutral ground in the universe. Every square inch, every split second is claimed by God and counterclaimed by Satan." Before Gretchen's cruel accident, she shared Dawkins' blind, contradictory faith. But after the accident, she discovered the reality of Dawkins' blind faith. Nature is indifferent to all suffering, offers no hope for the troubled heart. And it took her 7 years to reject this worldview and embrace the joy and the faith that nothing is an accident. Here's another item on Jesus' Christmas list. It's in Luke 21, 1-4, where Jesus singles out a widow's sacrificial faith. As he looked up, Jesus saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. I tell you the truth, he said. This poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. Earlier, we talked about the unseen faith, and here once again, Jesus uses the word saw. He saw her faith. He draws attention to it as to say, here is an example of the kind of faith that pleases me. Number 4 on God's wish list, acts of sacrificial love. Now, the widow didn't even know Jesus saw her gift, but her extravagant sacrificial act of love caught the attention of Jesus, and he spoke well of it. Think of what this poor widow did. She, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. Now, I would venture to say that all of us in this room know approximately how much money we have in our bank and investment accounts. Do we not? Imagine going to the bank, withdrawing it all, and giving that as a gift to the Lord. Would the ushers please come forward now for... No, just... Now listen, I suspect that few, if any of us, has ever done that. I certainly haven't, not even close. Which leads to another question. Do you even know of anyone, much less a poor widow, who essentially gave all they had to live on to the Lord, or the Lord's work? Well, listen, by God's grace, I do know someone like this. And his gift had a profound effect on my life and that of my children and my grandchildren. Am I exaggerating? No. Judge for yourself. When Marge was a junior at Grace Bible College in Omaha, Nebraska, in 1971, she signed up for an 8-week missions trip to Austria. In case you don't know, that really is Marge. Signing up was easy. Raising the money for the trip was hard. Now, Marge didn't ask her father to donate to this trip because she knew that her farmer father was one hailstorm away from bankruptcy. And the roof on their house desperately needed replacing. Marge grew up without indoor plumbing or TV or heat in a Minnesota upstairs bedroom, and their mother never owned a washing machine till they retired in town of Mountain Lake. So Marge looked to other sources. But in the end, she was $571 short of what she needed. And my future father-in-law, Peter Lowen, watched his daughter's faith struggle. And I suspect he was wrestling with his own faith struggle. And I know this because after I lost 2/3 of my income and went on disability, I was in the same boat as my father-in-law. My daughter Jenny needed to raise $50,000 for a 2-year missions trip to Cambodia right after she graduated from Trinity College. Like Peter Lowen, I struggled with what to do if she couldn't raise the funds. Would I have the faith to empty my retirement portfolio for my daughter's missions trip? I will never know. Because of one of the young couples that I married in my church. The girl grew up in my church, actually across the street from us. She became a nurse. She married a young doctor from Philadelphia. And they were brand new, just graduated, and he had something like $500,000 in school debt. Nevertheless, despite their debts, they joyfully donated $20,000 to Jenny's missions trip. And like Abraham, whose hand was stayed by the angel, my retirement portfolio was stayed by Angel Doctor and his wife. Not so Peter Lowen. Marge knew that her father loved her very much so. Never in doubt. He had nothing to prove. But in 1971, when he took her to the bank and emptied, and I mean emptied, his meager bank account to give her the money needed for her missions trip, it was a sacrificial gift of faith on the order of this poor widow that spoke volumes of his love for his daughter and his love for God and his love for the church and the value he placed on Christian missions and faith. And Peter Lowen for the choice between fixing the roof and missions, no contest. I wonder if Peter Lowen would not have given that gift, what would he have said to Marge when she asked what he thought of her going to seminary after she graduated? Are you kidding? That's going to cost me 10 times more than an 8-week missions trip. Probably more than 10 times. Instead, he said prophetically, Marjorie, the way he spoke, my best rendition of it with the German accent, Marjorie, I think you will make a fine pastor's wife. Indeed. After I graduated, 1 week later, I took a church, and 6 months after that, all of our school loans came due. Now, much of my seminary was paid for by the GI Bill as the son of a disabled veteran, and much of Marge's seminary was paid for by her working hard, skimping, and paying her way through, and help from her father. Much, but not all. And I was overwhelmed how we were going to pay these debts. And not long after that silent lament, Peter Lowen sent us a check for $500, and he continued to do so every quarter until his daughter's seminary education was completely paid off by him and not me. And 34 years after Peter Lowen's extravagant sacrificial gift, I was privileged to officiate at his funeral. And guess what I talked about? His extravagant sacrificial gifts of love that, like Abel, still speak to this day. We celebrate the birth of Jesus in 6 days. What will you give Jesus for Christmas? Is there something in the area of persevering, ongoing, stick to it, never give up faith? If so, please write it down and make a godly, God-empowered resolution. I'm going to do it. With God's help, nothing's going to stop me. Or perhaps it is risk-taking faith that God has prompted you to do after prayer. Someone to whom you need to reconcile by repentance and forgiveness. Someone you need to share the gospel. Or something else. If so, go for it. Resolve to do it, and even though It is God who gives you the resolve to give to him. He will be pleased, and he will speak well of it. Are you going through a hard time? Why not resolve in writing to joyfully bear the hard time and present this to God as an act of faith? Tell God, I'm not going to let anything or anyone or any pain keep me from joyfully praising you and being conscious of you more than the pain. And if you do, trust me, your grandchildren and your children will notice. They'll talk about it at the dinner table after you're gone. And this may be the very thing that leads them to Christ. Is there something in the way of sacrificial love, big or small, that you can do for someone in Jesus' name, prompted by the Lord? Even though Jesus owns everything, even though Jesus gives us everything to give to him, still, he'll be pleased and he'll brag about it. Finally, how about the gift of all to Jesus? I surrender. Offer yourself to him. He will speak well of it, and the angels will throw a party in heaven